Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rob Dunn. Rob is celebrity. Rob is a distinguished professor in applied ecology at NC State and also senior vice provost of interdisciplinary programs there, which is a new position he's just taken on this year. So far, so good. Rob got his start studying ants. He did his PhD at the University of Connecticut and a postdoc at Tennessee, Knoxville. But he is really such a broad thinker that it's impossible to encapsulate Rob's interests. And over the last 20 or however many years, I mean, he's started projects on understanding the biodiversity of human belly buttons and sourdough starter, and the biodiversity that exists in your apartment bathroom, in your shower head, under your bed. It's all there.
I mean, not yours personally, but
yes,
broader
yes.
sense. Yeah.
And you, of course, you can contribute your personal observations to his iNaturalist project. But so yeah, Rob really, I mean, he just doesn't think quite like the rest of us. He really thinks broadly. Somehow he has found the time to write at least 6 popular science books for the general public. The most recent of which is the Future of Natural History, Natural History of the Future, Natural History of the Future, which is a little bit related to some of the stuff he's going to talk about today, the whole living world and the entirety of its future. So, Rob, you take it away.
Thanks, Alan. And I'm gonna stay over here so people can hear me online. And if I start wandering away, somebody remind me. To wander is my inclination. So today, my goal is to get you to think a little bit about the farther future, a future different from the one we tend to think about as ecologists and evolutionary biologists. And so not just 10 years, not just 20 years, but 50, 100, 500, 1,000. And I think often we're uncomfortable thinking about that farther future. We don't plan for it very well. And often as ecologists and evolutionary biologists, we don't necessarily feel as though we always have skills that bear on that farther future. And so my big argument today is we do have skills that are very relevant to thinking about that farther future. And that if we don't involve ourselves in that thinking, that the status quo is very likely to be something that doesn't build on our knowledge, that doesn't build on our understanding of the living world. And I'll start with a little allegory of my main point today. And it's an allegory of a biodiversity institute in Germany that I won't name, that just built a beautiful, the beautiful new building that really is one of the best buildings I've ever seen in the world to get people to work collaboratively. And the scientists were deeply involved in designing the spaces where people would come together. They would have great coffee. It's Germany, so they would have great beer. They would have great food. And so those spaces are perfect. And I should say that this Biodiversity Institute is also one of the world leaders for thinking about how changes in climate influence organisms in general and animals in particular, including animals like humans. But the scientists in the building were not involved in designing the ways in which the building would respond to the changing conditions of Germany. And so as a result, this brand new building, built this year, finished this year, has no way to cool itself. And so even though we know that in this part of Germany, temperatures in the next 70 years are likely to increase by about 9 degrees Fahrenheit, with the summer highs much higher than that, the building is built in no way to accommodate that future. And so this summer in the heat wave, the interior space of the building reached something like 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was uninhabitable in its very first year of being. And so this is kind of an allegory in as much as we think about the ways in which we're making decisions about the future in general, we're making this kind of decision all of the time. And in my administrative role, I'm now very aware at North Carolina State University of the many decisions we make every day about buildings, about infrastructure, about who we're hiring and not hiring, that are going to have influences far into the future. And so, for example, we're building a new integrative sciences building. We hope that that building lives for 200 years. If that's the case, the sort of average inhabitant will be in that building in 2122. but we don't have conversations about what learning will be like in 21 to 22, what the outdoor environment will be like in that time. And so what I want you to get thinking about in this conversation today is how do we make sure that the things we do know about the future, the things we could know about the future as ecologists and evolutionary biologists, are being brought into these conversations. And rather than focus on the whole world and the entirety of its future, which is my interest, I'm going to zoom in a little bit today. I'm hoping to zoom in a little bit today to use the city as a microcosm and a metaphor for the broader story of the living future. And I'm doing this because I find cities super interesting. They're this amazing interface of the living world and the human part of the living world and our decisions, but also because increasingly the world simply is urban from a human perspective, and that this change is radical. It's very at odds with what the past was like. And so if we're thinking about the future, cities are an important component of that story. But before I get to cities, and sorry, online people, I'm just a wandering person, I'm trying hard. I want to talk a little bit about what dwellings were like for most of human history, which is that for most of human history, dwellings were vernacular dwellings. They didn't have an architect. They were built on the basis of traditional knowledge. And as a result, they tended to be very adaptive culturally relative to their climates. And so, for example, you can see houses in Thailand, Peru, and Scotland on stilts in places that flood all the time. And if you look at different aspects of vernacular houses, they very often had this connection to the environment. They also had features that were not connected to the environment, but this was part of their story. And the earliest cities also were locally adapted to varying extents. And so this is a depiction of the ancient Mesopotamian city of Ur. And one could argue that the details of the ways in which the city was built made sense given their local climate and local organisms. But there were also things that were beginning to emerge that just had to do with being a city. But over time, what would happen, especially in the Western tradition, is that cities begin to reflect ideas and ideologies and other forces. And so this is a famous Renaissance painting of the ideal city. And the ideal city, this painting suggests, celebrates the values in a well-ordered society with architecture standing as a metaphor for good government. And this painting is fascinating to me. But one of the things that fascinates me is if you don't know architectural history, if you're not familiar with Italy, you can't place this city. There are no trees, there's no other landscape. It could be anywhere, and it doesn't seem to be related to the environment. And this, through time, will become ever more true. And so we move eventually to what's been called by architects and urban planners the anti-gravity city, where cities become framed relative to the force of gravity, and the anti-gravity city celebrates the power of engineering. And they take all sorts of amazing forms, some of them quite beautiful, at least in rendering. Often the early versions of these anti-gravity cities had these tubes that would connect people among the tops of the buildings. And so it was this sort of imaginary where we would just do away with the ground and we would just walk back and forth high up, which didn't fully become realized. In some cases, there'd be these little trams that would take you around high up. But in many respects, the anti-gravity city emerged. It's a dominant feature of most of our cities, increasingly it's a dominant feature of Raleigh. And then we moved on to the moto city, especially in the United States, but again, this culture then spreads globally, where the city is framed relative to the force of cars, and the moto city celebrates a response to the power of the car as a nature-like force. They're not really designed for people, they're designed for vehicles. Again, sometimes quite beautiful. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's vision for Los Angeles Civic Center, and yet framed relative to cars. And then if you look online now, or if you look in a lot of speculative fiction, or if you go to an engineering department and you ask about the future of cities, very often what you see is the future framed relative to the internet and algorithms. And so if we think about what force is structuring the future of cities, it's a smart city model. And the smart city celebrates in response to the nature-like power of the internet. And in all of this, there's not much room for ecologists and evolutionary biologists. We got drawn out very early in this story. And we got drawn out because the environment is receded. Adaptation no longer occurs in relation to local climate or local biological realities. The idealized cities become abstracted and exist in reference to physical universals. And life and climate are excluded through control. And this takes its extreme forms in bubble cities. which have been popular at different times historically. So this is a Buckminster Fuller imagining of Manhattan, over a part of Manhattan, where you could actually exclude non-New Yorkers, you would exclude all living organisms, you would exclude all external air. And this was Buckminster Fuller's utopian model for what you would do there, which is crazy. But really, then we really, begin to imagine we're not part of the story at all. And this seems really far-fetched, but it's also what imaginings of other planets and what we might do in other planets look like. This is an old-timey magazine cover, but if you think about Elon Musk's visions for Mars and other planets, they have many of these same features, just different colors and fonts. And of course, this is the framework for the Jetsons. Many of you are too young for the Jetsons. And no recognition. Okay. All right, great. So the dog's Astro, I forget the family's name. But what you'll note in the Jetsons is they're in bubbles, and the only non-human life is the dog, and the dog gets its own bubble, and that's it. Another transition in the history of urban planning and architecture and design is the move toward green cities, which has two versions. There's an ecological version, which we're probably more familiar with in this room, where we re-green cities, we re-wild cities. I would say, like in the architectural world, that's a quieter note. It's there, but it's quieter. And then there's this vision, which is the garden city. But note, this is Dixon de Pommier, who has this vision for vertical gardens in cities, which is becoming real in some cities. But note, the gardens are inside bubbles again. And so this is a world that's more comfortable to urban planners and architects because you're still controlling things. And in all of these, to me, this is the model that we're imagining. We're imagining a model where we're holding urbanization, we're holding cities, we're in control, we're creating something, and that there are no other forces other than those that are purely physical or that we're somehow facilitating. And my big argument today is that implicit in this view and all these views is a false set of assumptions. Knowingness, lifelessness, control, independence in a living world without agency. Some of these will seem overly obvious to you as ecologists and evolutionary biologists, but they're not obvious to people who in practice are making decisions about these things. And so one of my goals is to figure out how do we lift these up so that they're seen in a more conspicuous way, and how do we do it while also making sure we attach to those ideas that we lift up all of the details that we know to be true and all the contingencies. And so I'm going to walk through these assumptions and what's wrong about them. There are 6 main ones, and the 7th one I'll sort of circle around to. And this is sort of the take home of the talk today. It's also part of this book, which is that life is a force more powerful than gravity or engineers or cars or the internet, and will only make sensible choices about the future if we understand our assumptions and life's rules. One might even call them laws. So you can totally zone out if you just wanted the higher level stuff. If you're online and you have other stuff to do, like laundry or kitchen stuff, you're good. But there may be some good anecdotes from here on out, so you could still stick around. So the first assumption is knowing this. And this is an assumption that it's very hard to shake ourselves away from, I think, even as biologists. And it's the idea that we mostly know the world around us. And to me, this is one I have to remind myself, almost mantra-like, of, because the world looks familiar. And yet the truth is, if we zero in on what we know about the living world, that most of the axes we can zero in on, we know far less than we think. This would be a familiar character to some of you, but not all. Hopefully, this is Terry Irwin. He died a couple of years ago now. Amazing systematist who studied ground beetles, which by a quirk of nomenclature pretty much live exclusively in the tops of trees, with the exception of ones that live in temperate zones. And so he figured this out early in his career. He loved ground beetles. He wanted to go name and classify ground beetles and trees. And he went to Panama, figured out that he could fog the tops of trees, the beetles would fall down, and then he could gather them up like a child with that kind of joy and exuberance and begin to name them. But what he found was when he did this, that almost everything that fell out of the first tree, individual tree he sampled, was new to science. And so he called his friends. There's a longer story, but in essence, he says, like, look, if all these beetles are new, what about the other kinds of beetles? What about the butterflies? What about the, you didn't call an ant person ever, and I feel a little bit bad about that. But in general, this was the process. And what they found is almost every group of organisms people looked at, most of the species falling out of these tropical trees were new to science. And so he starts to publish on this slowly, starts to name these species. It's slow work to name species. And he talks also to his friend Peter Raven, who was at the Missouri Botanical Garden at the time. And Peter was in a National Science Foundation meeting about the state of biodiversity. And Peter said, well, Terry, if you're finding all these new species in trees, could you estimate how many insect species there might be in a hectare of forest? And Terry first calls him back and says, no, that's ridiculous. I just want to name the beetles. It's like not a good use of my time. There are so many beetles. And finally, he relents and tries to do this. And he writes this really short paper. It's like this and one other page like this, using the data he has. And we could go through this in detail later, but to estimate that if his trees that he sampled are representative, that there might be as many as 30 million arthropod species globally. This ignites just a wave of passive aggressive, angry response papers from other entomologists. And that's sort of where I entered the story as a graduate student. I get to see these passive aggressive papers, and that's super exciting. We don't know anything. Maybe we do know something. This person doesn't like that person. I mean, it was great stuff. And what slowly emerged as the reality, I think, is that we actually know too little to say with much certainty. And what we've come to is a kind of consensus that there's a lot that's unknown. And if it's more than this, this is Nigel Stork and his estimate. So Nigel estimates 1.5 million beetle species, 5 million insects, 7 million arthropods, 80% undiscovered. I would say in general, the thinking is that this is a lower bound. And so that means 80% of arthropod species are not yet named. And we don't go about studying the living world as though this is the case. We certainly don't go about living as though this is the case. And so this to me is important because when we manage cities, we manage the world, we think about a big tropical city and what's going to happen as we change it. We assume that we at least know the species that are there, and we're not even close. And then in my career, I had a transition where I started to work more and more on not just insects, but also microbes. And the reality for microbes makes the insect diversity look silly. And so there's a beautiful image by Scott Chmielewski of an organism that can be very problematic, but also totally sublime. And the question became in the last sort of 10 years, could we even think about how many microbe species there might be? And then kind of Flossie and Jay Lennon pulled together this estimate based on scaling that there might be 1 trillion species of bacteria. And so this is debated a lot, but I think a big conclusion here is even if they're wrong by 3 zeros, we're still at 1 billion, and there are only 30,000 named bacteria species. And so the big point here is like giant unknown, teeny known, and there will be more passive aggressive papers back and forth. And so to me, this is an important part of how we think about the future world. We really know very little. Our estimates is like right now, as you breathe in, the average breath has about 400 species. About 10 of those are named. Right? So just if we want to think, how does this intersect with your daily life? It intersects with it every day. And then you get things like bacteriophages, which there's at least a bacteriophage for a bacteria species. Current estimates, there may be more than one. If there are 1 trillion bacteria species, how many kinds of bacteriophages? Each flea, about half a smaller flea upon it. Assumption 2 is that life is fragile. This is the end of nature assumption. And what we know for sure is that many species are fragile. We've lost many species. Many of the ecosystems we love and depend on are fragile. Most of the species we depend on for our survival and well-being are fragile given what we're doing to the world. But that's different from saying nature itself is fragile. And this occurred to me a number of years ago when we were studying, doing a lot of work in New York City. This is Manhattan laid on its end, at Central Park in the middle, and Wood at the right there. And we started off by studying the green spaces in Manhattan. What was there, trying to figure out the biology of those green spaces. It was super fun because you could study there and then you could go have an amazing coffee. You could study there and then you could have amazing Korean food. So it was a good life choice. But as we studied those green spaces, we kept finding new species, new things going on in those green spaces. And we started to wonder, what's going on in those gray spaces where we basically tried to kill everything? What do you see in these places where we've used pesticides, insecticides, rodenticides, herbicides, and we've sealed everything in as tightly as we can. That should be the end of nature. And you notice, and this is on Broadway. I forget, that's the that green, the little green space is the top of a theater, and I'm forgetting which one. But basically, this is a gray space. And so we started studying these gray spaces. We started in Raleigh. This is Matt Bertone, not to scale. And so we started off by just going into houses, and Matt led this work to figure out how many arthropod species, focusing on the big stuff to start, we would find in a given house. And when we talked to entomologists about this, they said it was a super boring project and this is what we would find, which to me in science is either a sign you're onto something really good because people have ignored it, or you're onto something terrible. And so I was hopeful / fearful. And so we go into the first houses. And what we find is that when you look around in spaces and houses, you find a lot more than you think. This is an amazing painting by the artist Eleanor Olson, who responded to some of our work. There's a camel cricket, there are mice, all kinds of stuff going on here. You find the same thing in living rooms. And in total, in the first 30 houses, we found at least 1,000 species of arthropods, first 50 houses. We say at least because there were whole groups of arthropods for which we could find no experts on Earth willing to name them. And so we could just identify them to genus, and that's as well as we've been able to do for these animals living in houses in a major city. And so this suggests that there's more there than we would expect. And so then we started to do this kind of CSI, bedroom, bathroom, and beyond. And so we would get people to swab dust in their homes, and then we would have them send samples of the dust to our lab, made us look like Santa's workshop. And then we break and open the cells in the dust. We would make copies of the DNA and identify who was present based on the DNA. When we started, you could do this for bacteria using barcoding genes. By the time this project was done, you could do it for plants, you could do it for animals, you could do it for fungi. And we actually just figured out we can actually do this with Kelly Mecklejohn at the vet school in NC State. We can do this for humans. And so we can find in dust individual human DNA and identify it, separate project, but related. So there's a lot going on in the dust. And so we thought, well, what can we find in the dust that tells us about what's been in these houses? Super quick version of many thousands of hours of work. We found thousands of plant species. A lot of those are things blowing into the house. It's also house plants. It's cabbage if you're eating cabbage. If you're smoking weed, we pick up the DNA from the marijuana. I'm not checking. I'm just telling you we are able to do that. Got awkwardly quiet for a second. Presumably UNC could also do it, but no. But so we found 40,000 fungal species, which is more fungal species than there are named in North America, which isn't to say houses are the hot spots of biodiversity for fungi. It's just to say fungi are still vastly understudied. 2,000 arthropod species, which matches up with what we saw when we went into houses, and 80,000 species of bacteria. And in fact, it's far more. And so there's a lot of life in houses. And when we found this, people said, yeah, but I know a place in my house that's got no life. Why don't you check this really extreme place? And so we started to sample hot water heaters, refrigerators, freezers. And in fact, that's where we found some of the highest biomass sites in houses, is because these places that we think of as the end of nature are actually great habitats for many small species. And so in hot water heaters, we found species that are basically known from hot springs and hot water heaters. And so you can go to Iceland and sit in a hot spring and they're there, or you can go into your basement and crack open your hot water heater. Different ethos, but similar microbes. We have no idea how they get there. That's basically the end of that story. Refrigerators and freezers, we see food-associated things, but we also see things typically found in the Arctic. And so we're recreating this little habitat, pretty high biomass, fermented foods, tons of extraordinary biomass. And then weird places like dishwasher soap dishes, which you would imagine is someplace that, like, that's the, if we're going to create the end of nature somewhere, that should be it. They're full of all these extremophile fungus species, including a species that the last time I checked, it's only known from dishwashers and the feces of tropical fruit bats. And it's not that those two, I don't think those two are related. Like, I mean, we never know about people's lifestyles, but I think it just says that we don't know, right? Like that there's a huge gap in our understanding. Probably it's an entire lineage of fungus that's radiated and does all kinds of things. And we're just seeing these two lineages, these two places. But they love that habitat. And so in these environments, it's not the end of nature. Even in salt crystals, we find inside salt crystals extremophile halophiles. They love salt. And we can actually do a little bit of parsing of which ocean your table salt might have come from, if it came from an ocean, based on which microbes are in the salt shaker. And some of those salt associated microbes are actually kind of square shaped to best take advantage of the weird shape inside the salt crystal. It's a super cool environment, not the end of nature. In fact, never have we found lifelessness despite our actions. And there's no sign of the end of living nature in these places that we're trying to kill everything. And I would also argue that there's no sign of the end of living nature in the worst of our assaults, nonetheless favor some species. This by no means means this is what we should do, but it's a different storyline than the story that we're killing off nature. Nature itself is far more perseverant than we imagine. Nature that sustains us, nature that's beautiful, nature that respects the amazing history and wonder of biodiversity is at risk. But nature as a process is more enduring. The third assumption is that we're in control. It's an assumption embodied by the painting of the priest holding the building. And I think our assumption here is very wrong because our control is often very modest. And here I'll again use examples from homes. This is an old figure, some of you might have seen it before. This is just a PCA plot. This is from samples of bacteria in houses. Points are closer together means they have a similar composition of bacteria species. Points are farther apart, have different composition, and they're color coded by the habitat that was sampled. And so what you can see here, these are blue, purple, or blue, and some other blue. And those are habitats that have a lot of leaf and soil associated microbes. Increasingly, our understanding is that those tend to be beneficial for immune health. And so that's sort of a good news suite. The green shades are food associated microbes. Some of those are good, some are bad. And you know, the kitchen counter versus cutting board, quite similar. This is somebody who like threw a hot dog at a TV or something, I don't know. And the part nobody likes at top is we can't tell toilet seats and pillowcases apart very well. But in general, could be yours is different. It's not. But the big take home here is that we imagine we have nuanced control. And in fact, this is a very sloppy kind of control. Like our control is, do we open the door? Do we open the window? Our control is, we make food here. Where do we flop our body down? And so from a microbial perspective, that's very modest control. The other kind of control we see is a function of how many people live in a dwelling. More people relative to the area, more body microbes, more men, more armpit microbes, more women, more vaginal microbes. And we can detect this at a pretty predictably. The biggest effect is dogs. If you have dogs in your house, it totally transforms the household microbiome. A whole suite of species become more common. They become more common on TV screens and pillowcases. So not just where the dog is, but they sort of float out and they're everywhere. There's some evidence that in urban environments, this is actually beneficial. We can talk about that later. But the key point being, that's not fine control. That's the sort of accidental consequence of our behavior. If you ferment food, those microbes go through the house, sourdough. If you open your windows versus use central air, that affects the microbes. But these are really coarse influences. And what reminded me of this is I had a student, Megan Temis, who did some work with collaborators studying the nests of chimpanzees to think about how do nests of chimps compare to human homes. And what we imagined is nests of chimps would be full of chimp fecal microbes and chimp associated ectoparasites. What we in fact found, or what Megan found, is that chimp nests were exclusively leaf and soil associated microbes. And so from a public health standpoint, we benefited enormously from hand washing, from clean drinking water, from vaccination. But our management of the overall microbiome in our houses has almost certainly created environments that are less healthy than a chimp nest. And that to me is sobering. I mean, if the chimp washed its hands and was vaccinated. At this point in my talk, there's often a sentiment and almost like a groan, but I can seal my building, I can filter my air, I can scrub and isolate. And sometimes people raise their hand just to contribute that so other people know that about them. And for me, I was trying to think about how do I think about, well, what's the extreme case? If you really seal things in, you really scrub things super well, how much could you exclude life and control it? And I think the sort of case in point here is the International Space Station and the former Russian space station, the Mir. The windows do, well, the doors open, but no life is coming in so far as we know. Everything that goes up there is scrubbed and bleached. Astronauts are checked. What do you see on in these dwellings? And in fact, what you see is crazy fungus. You see dust mites. International Space Station has tapeworms for reasons that are not entirely clear. And especially on the Mir, most of the fungi were plastic eaters or even metal eaters, species tolerant of extremes. This included fungi that grew over the windows of the Mir to the point of making it impossible to see outside. And so the grandeur of space was obscured by the power of life. As a biologist, I like that, but also probably it's problematic. And so the key take home is that even when we're trying to control everything, what we favor is not something we've controlled, but species that are really good at dealing with what we've done. And so either species that deal with those extremes, or they fall from bodies. And the bacteria, this is studied by Jonathan Eisen's group using the same approach that we use, and found that the space station looks a lot like a toilet seat or a pillowcase from a bacterial standpoint. NASA asked me not to use this slide, but I find it too fun. And the one place we do see control in these daily environments, and we see it consistently, is kind of an inadvertent control. We can control in the short term things using herbicides, antibiotics, other biocides. We need to, it's extraordinarily important, but our more common control is that we overuse them, and what we do is to favor resistant organisms. And so as we look at urban environments and we sample, and people have really tried to exclude everything, this is one of the groups of organisms that we see very often being favored. Not always, and we can do those things more wisely, but it's not always our approach. The fourth assumption is that we're independent. As ecologists, we know this can't possibly be true, but it's somehow, it feels something we feel very strongly in the West, especially. And to me, I think we often feel like our perceived relation to the rest of life is that we're the top of this Calder mobile. And I think when Elon Musk flings himself into space, or Jeff Bezos flings himself into space, that this is their model, that they're in control of all these other species that depend on them. And the question is not, what do they need? It's what do they want to bring with them? What would they like to choose? And for me, the reality as we look at our relationship to the rest of life is we're actually more like a piece at the bottom of the Calder sculpture. And termites are actually emblematic of what I think this relationship is really often like for humans and other species. Termite queen, termite king, workers around the edges. And we've known for a while that termites depend on their gut microbes to digest their food. To differing extents, all termite species depend on those microbes to differing extent among lineages. But for many termite species, this dependence is so extreme that the termite and the microbes are mutually unculturable. We haven't yet figured out how to grow the termites without their microbes. We haven't yet figured out how to grow the microbes without their termites. And people have tried, because if you could figure out how to grow all these microbes, you could use them industrially to do lots of things. Some of them are culturable, but very often the whole suite is not. And so as a result, termites have all sorts of adaptations for making sure next generations inherit these microbes. It's a very functional system. Both queens and kings carry microbes with them, pass them along, and then they're shared among individuals via things that are probably not popular among humans, but they share them orally, but also anally, well, I know that's not popular, but and so there's their system. But increasingly, as we study ourselves and we begin to recognize that we're not different from other animal species, we recognize that we too depend on all these microbial species. And we're seeing all these sorts of disorders that are often not exclusively microbial in their nature, but often have a component that relates to missing key microbes or having a shift in key microbes. And they're resulting in one way or another from our failure to acquire the microbes we would have historically acquired. As a group in this room, probably, well, it's almost certain that we're missing a whole suite of lineages of key microbes that our ancestors had 200 years ago. And in some of the cases, that's because they're not being passed on during birth, during C-section births. In other cases, there are other things going on we don't totally understand. And some of these microbes are probably lost because we're not being exposed to soil and leaves in the same way. We don't fully get the process of loss. We know as we're losing these things, and we know that it's necessary to acquire them. And so we're in a tricky moment. On top of that, and so these are all our dependencies, right? We depend on microbes from our mothers, we depend on soil microbes, we depend on leaf microbes. On top of that, we consume tens of thousands of species, each of which is dependent on tens or more of other species. And so when you think about astronauts in space, the reality of their life is that they go to space reliant on the microbes they got from their mothers, from hospital rooms, from soil, from leaves, and they depend on those microbes to survive. In addition, all of their food is packed up from Earth. And so they depend on those crops, but they also depend on the pollinators of those crops, on the corn case. In other cases, they also depend on root-associated microbes, and they need those things to survive, and we need those collectively to survive. And on top of that, right now, all the feces from space is packed back to Earth. It's not rolled by dung beetles, but it's decomposed by Earth microbes. And so this is a really extraordinary dependence. And I use space as an example because I think often when we think about space, we're also thinking about the future that we imagine for ourselves. And one of my sort of key discoveries recently in this context is I had a chance to interview Christina Cook, the astronaut who was on the International Space Station for almost a year. And she was talking about that experience. And one of the things she said is one of her favorite moments in the International Space Station was when she got to water these little plants. And you could smell the plants and it reminded her of Earth, and it was this deep connection. And so therein are two stories. One is that the other connection we have to these species is a psychological connection, that even among the people who would most like to leave the planet remains. The other is if you look at these plants, they don't look good. And the reason is we've already inadvertently introduced plant pathogens to the International Space Station. And so those plant pathogens are killing their plant experiments. And so now there are projects to send out plant probiotics to help the plants withstand the plant pathogens that we accidentally introduced because our dependence is complex. And so a termite queen, when she flies, needs to only carry her microbes. We must carry everything. And also, because we're so ignorant, we don't know yet what we depend on fully. And so we also have to carry the species we might someday depend on, but don't yet depend on, and the species we don't know we depend on. It's a tricky endeavor. The fifth, and the sixth is the last big one of these, so you know where you are in the talk. Then there's a little turn. Our sixth assumption is we have full agency, which is a little different than saying we have control. It's that we have the ability to decide, the ability to distance ourselves from our past and from our current conditions. And I think in an evolutionary context, it's very clear that this is a very problematic assumption. And one of the sort of silly studies that we did that reminded me of this is that we actually, when we were engaging people to study their homes, we also had them put data loggers in their homes to measure temperature and humidity. And we were trying to figure out, well, what kinds of conditions are we making in homes and which species do you favor? We started working on this, and one of the things we saw was that the range of temperatures and humidities in the US that people were keeping their homes at was really quite narrow. And it was widened in really extreme climates where people had a little bit less control, but that preferred range was narrow. And then we began to look globally, and even though European temperature preferences are different than in the US, they still fall within this relatively narrow bound. And so one of the things we were able to look at was, well, what does that possibly correspond to? And it actually matches very well the climatic conditions in which we've evolved over the last million years. And so we have thermal preferences and humidity preferences that were shaped by our ancestry. This is not a big discovery. It's a quirky discovery as part of a quirky study, except that as we think of future climates, we think about the heat wave in Europe this summer, for example. It's that thermal comfort window that has huge impacts for when and how people can do work. And that thermal comfort window hits people way before they reach physiological limits. And so this has a big impact on how we spend on air conditioning, the fossil fuels that we use. And as we think about climate change more generally, this turns out to dovetail with what we're seeing with regard to the effects of climate change on violence, on migration, on economic productivity, that we actually see declines in human well-being well before physiological limits are approached that relate to these preferences. And so this work didn't build on ours, but it related to that quirky work that we did as a reminder of the fact that we're still very connected to the details of our ancestry. Another example, again, a little bit quirky. Deanna Beasley was a postdoc in my lab for a while, and we were talking about the evolution of the stomach. And if you look at medical textbooks, the standard story of the human stomach is that its primary function is to break down proteins. It's sort of this initial wave of digestion before you get to the intestines. But Deanna had been looking at other vertebrates, and one of the things she noticed is that the stomach pH was really variable. And even in some species that eat lots of protein, often they had stomachs that weren't very acidic. And so what was going on? And so she hypothesized that maybe what was going on is the stomach also played a key role in killing potential pathogens before they got to the gut. And if that was the case, you would expect stomachs of species that are eating foods that are likely to have pathogens to be more acidic. And so what she found was, in fact, that this appears to be the case. Obviously, scavengers have far more acidic stomachs. You move to herbivores, it gets a little complex depending on the gut arrangement, but they're far more neutral. And in general, this seems to be part of the story. And there's a lot of other evidence that suggests that this is taking place. For example, in humans, if you take a medicine that lowers the pH of your stomach, we know empirically that you're at much greater risk of foodborne pathogens. And so this seems to make sense. And so we started studying this in more detail. And we zoomed in on the primates. It turns out the primate data are terrible. But one of the other things we started to see is that humans are really weird in this story. And so our stomach pH is far more like a white-backed vulture than any primate yet studied. There's only one individual chimp that's ever been studied at a pH of 7. We'll see if that remains. I partnered with Sandra Anderson at the University of Copenhagen, who now has a pill that you can give to zoo animals that they swallow. It records pH and samples microbes as it goes down. And so we've started to use that to be able to get pH from other primates while they're still alive and happy. And so we'll see more. But the reason I include this here is that this is a quirk of our evolutionary history, one way or another. It's an interesting question why we have the stomach pH that's so acidic. But one of the consequences is that when we're acquiring beneficial microbes, our window to do so is very narrow. And it's basically the first year and a half of life before the stomach becomes fully acidic. And so we're actually far more predisposed to losing and not regaining key gut microbes than other species are because we have this filter as a function of details of our evolutionary history we don't understand yet. And so we don't really, we imagine ourselves to be freewheeling and be able to make any kind of choice, but we have these quirks of our past that, and there are many of them, that matter. The sixth assumption, and the last major one, is that non-human life has no agency. And I think this is patently false. And it's also a little bit problematic in the context of the idea of the Anthropocene, Anthropocene being that we're in a human era defined by human actions. And I would argue one of that there are a number of problems with that idea, but one is it suggests that the other species don't have any role in the future of what's happening. And I think we spent the last year seeing that other species can have a big role. And here by agency, I mean the capacity of an actor in a given environment. I don't mean conscious agency. And so I would argue that we can think of the coronaviruses as having had agency in the story of the last few years. Certainly human actions precipitated the pandemic. Everybody put their masks on all of a sudden, sorry. But the details of the biology, the organism, the evolution also influenced how that unfolded. If we can look back at plagues caused by plant pathogens, I think we would argue that the same kinds of things are happening. And if that's true, I think we need to make different kinds of decisions, and we can talk more about this. And then the other thing I would argue, and this is a really big point masquerading as a small point because of my audience, is that all the things we know about the workings of the ecological world bear on our future. All of the rules we study with such passion bear on the details of how the ecological world is going to respond to our actions. And we know about those things, but our community is tiny. And in my experience, that means that those rules, that understanding is basically totally absent from the decision-making that relates to these living worlds. And so I would say this last assumption is basically that what ecologists and evolutionary biologists know doesn't actually matter too much, and so we don't need to have them at the table. And the argument that our life work makes is that that's wrong. But I think for that argument to be meaningful, we have to find ways to connect and think about imagining cities, imagining futures that build on all the things we know about the living world in meaningful ways, And I'll pause right there to say that if we're going to actually do this in a serious way, we need to find ways to be at the table and that we aren't right now. And in my personal experience, one example of this is I started working with one of my previous books. I maligned architects in the end of the book. And as a result, lots of architects wrote me, mostly with nice ideas. And what I'd maligned them about is that there weren't many architects thinking seriously about how we think about a more beneficial nature indoors in our homes. And it turned out there were few. And there were people who were interested in it, but didn't have a plan for what they would do. And so those architects reached out, including an architect working in DC who's working on a new low-income housing project, and said, look, we're ready to work with you. What do we do? At which point I realized I knew a lot about these worlds, but I actually didn't know the questions the architects had or what the answers were that they needed. And so what I could answer them with were answers that were too vague for them to actually implement. And so I think we have to be at the table early enough so that these stakeholders can make use of what we know. And just as a simple example, the architect wanted to know how much green space do we need for the right microbes to be outside that would benefit human health inside. And nobody's ever studied it. We have no idea. We don't even know which plant species it would be. And we're not trying to study it because nobody ever asked us. And nobody ever asked us because we didn't make clear that we had something to contribute. And so I think this is a big question for us moving forward. It's part of my new job. But the other thing I'll say sort of quickly is that when I've had these meetings, there's often a resistance to the far future. And so when I talk to city planners and architects, they often talk about resistance from us with regard to our willingness to think about the far future and their willingness to think about the consequences of different human scenarios for life. But they also know that they'll continue to build whether or not ecologists and evolutionary biologists are part of the conversation. And what's being built today will have a long legacy of consequences and interactions between humans and the rest of the living world. I think about this every day because I'm in charge of a new building, a new integrative sciences building in NC State. How do I think about the living future, the climate future, as we make these decisions in the next 6 months about this building? How do I take this seriously? And how do I convince people working with me that I may know something that's useful here? But to put a finer point on this, or a broader point, I want to go back quickly to the Etruscans, who lived in what is now modern Rome before the ancient Romans. And the Etruscans built a cloaca maxima. They didn't call it that yet, but that's what it was. A stormwater sewer beneath their proto-city. And for reasons that are lost to history, it was way overbuilt for their needs. And it was built around 600 BCE. And what was amazing about that cloaca maxima is that when Pliny the Elder writes in the year 79, Common Era, the streets, you could say, in the streets above, massive blocks of stone are dragged along, and yet the tunnels do not cave. They're pounded by falling buildings. The ground is shaken by earth tremors, but in spite of it all, for 700 years, the channels have remained well nigh impregnable. What are we building today? What are we informing today that's still going to be used in 700 years? And what will its use be? What's even more amazing is that in 1778, that cloaca maxima outlet could still be depicted and it was still working. What's even more amazing is that in 1961, Lewis Mumford could write, with its record of continuous service for more than 2,500 years, that sewer structure proves that in the planning of cities low first cost, not necessarily denote economy. On these terms, the cloaca maxima has turned out to be one of the cheapest pieces of engineering on record. So these legacies are long. And they continue. This is the cloaca maxima today. It does not account for all of Rome's stormwater, as you might imagine, but right beneath the old city, it still plays a role. And the point is, the infrastructure we're building today is already the groundwork for a particular future. The inertia of infrastructure is extraordinary. Some of what we build will have influences for several thousand years, like the cloaca maxima. And our default is to build infrastructure without a vision, infrastructure that simply builds in the past. And here's my final example. This is I-85. Google tells me it takes me about 8 hours and 24 minutes to drive it, but I'm not a good driver, so it'll take longer. But we, a number of years ago, led by Adam Taranto, decided to figure out, in this sort of region of I-85 in the southeast, what might the future of urbanization look like? And so Adam led this effort to use a variety of kinds of models. First one published on, the second one at work. to figure out if the status quo for urbanization continued, what would the city look like? And one of the things that one sees is that you get a giant city that we dubbed Charlanta that stretches from Charlotte to Atlanta. Actually stretches all the way to Richmond. But what's amazing about this city is its location is basically entirely governed by the location of I-85. Because once you start building cities, the most likely additional building connects with the existing structure. And so this is amazing because, I-85 was not built imagining a giant megacity. It was built as a way to connect this landscape. What's even more amazing is that the reason I-85 is right there is because that was the Native American route pre-colonially north and south for trading and movement. And it was the Native American route for trading and movement because it was the easiest place to cross the rivers on foot. And so we're building a mega city in a particular location because it was the easiest place to cross the rivers on foot. What's even more amazing is a recent archaeological study. I don't have a pointer, but can you see this line up top of the two arrows? So this study suggests that the Clovis people were using that route as a trading route 10,000 years ago, as identified by spear points that are located along that trading route. And so basically, we're building a future city on a 10,000-year-old footpath. And so current decisions have these long legacies. And so what do we want to build today that will have this long legacy? How do we think about the things that we build in such a way that that legacy engenders future cities, future worlds that resemble what we would like? And my argument is to do it, we need all of these people at the table. We need ecologists and evolutionary biologists, we need architects, economists, entomology, engineering, anthropology, veterinary medicine. And we don't need all these people to be broad, but we need them all to have discipline. We need many of them have disciplinary depth, but they have to be able to talk to each other. They have to meet each other, and they have to be familiar enough with each other's goals to listen to each other. And that's remarkably hard. And as students here, you're actually in an amazing moment to be able to develop those skills to hear people, because you're at a place with all of these amazing people. But the default, and I'll say at my institution, not yours, it could be very different, is that we don't stage those meetings very often. And so how do you find them for yourself? And so I will close there. Thank you very much. Hopefully you could hear online people.
Thank you, Rob. We've got time for questions. In the back.
Chris?
A lot of what you talked about, like people want prescriptions, particularly from the news that says eat chocolate, open window, grow a house plant.
Yeah.
Because it's, science just said it's good for you.
Yeah.
But I feel like that there's so much more bigger than that, and it seems like a bigger challenge. So how do scientists or science communicators, students reframe it?
I think it's yes and. So I think we do need those prescriptions when we can offer them. And so, for example, there's a study by Doug Ptolemy, and I'm not going to get it quite right, suggesting a percentage of native plants you need on landscapes in a particular region in order to have goldfinches in that local habitat. Architects love that study, and they're actively using it to figure out, when they're doing a big building site, what percentage of native plants do they need. And so that study is undoubtedly too simple for what they're using it for, but it's still a useful place to start, and then we can refine it. And so I think we do need concrete benchmarks for people to be able to build around. But then we also need at the same time these bigger conversations about what do we want. And I'll be honest and say I'm struggling to think about how do we do them best. And one of the groups of people that seem most creative in thinking about these alternate scenarios are actually speculative fiction writers. And so I'm starting to work with Cadwell Turnbull at NC State, who's a speculative fiction writer, to figure out with his MFA students, can we pair the MFA students with ecologists and evolutionary biologists, and have the MFA students writing about different futures, but then asking about what's biologically possible, what's plausible, with the idea that can we generate new conversations across that. We haven't done it yet. It is totally possible it will go terribly. But I think experimenting with those new kinds of conversations and And recognizing that it's not easy to imagine different scenarios. Like I think if we're, as biologists, the scenarios we're often most familiar with are climate scenarios, climate change scenarios. But if you notice, our climate change scenarios, except the more recent incarnations better, but they tend to be based primarily on emissions, not on the lived world that is implied by those emissions. And so you're sort of cheating and saying, like, we don't want to deal with humans, they're really difficult, but we'll just deal with the net output of humans. It's like viewing all of civilization through like the outflow of a toilet, right? Like that's, and so I think we have to deal with that hard reality. Like we have to figure out what humans are doing and how do we interface with that. So I don't have an easy answer. But I think it requires ambitious new ways of trying to talk. I don't know, anybody else have a better answer?
I don't have an answer, but I mean, like, I would say the CDC should forward this talk, your Zoom talk, to all the Chapel Hill and Harborough city planners and the city councils, right? I mean, they may listen to it, they may not, but at least we're, that's a start.
Yeah, and I think
Because I mean, they should be here, and they're not.
yeah, I won't self-tout my own talk, but I do think like reaching out to those, finding ways to reach out to those communities. And my experience in this new administrative role is that there are way more people that want to connect than you might imagine, but they're just invisible. And so from an administrator's perspective, how do we bring those people together? But from an individual perspective, I think to assume more goodwill in those other fields than you imagine. And so to reach out to those city planners, to get things out to them, and to assume that a few might be interested, because even if a few are, it could have huge impacts really quickly. And this new job is interesting, and there's plenty of unpleasant stuff with it, and that's an administrative role. But one of the most pleasant features of it is the number of people who want to do new interdisciplinary work in new ways, and they're just looking for a way to do it, looking for people to partner with, is extraordinary. And so I think that's actually a very hopeful part of this, that there are out in our silos, there are a lot of people who would like to work together more on real world things. Sorry, that's a long response to that, but yeah, thank you.
So, your example of I don't like to give you or the immersion of these kinds of things. If you talk about planning for the future, how do you plan? You can't just have our fingers and say, here's a better way to do this because we have all this built in. So how would you make a case of how you incorporate overcoming inertia versus working with the inertia that's already built into for planning for the future? With going to give us as well, we're going to have something like Charlotte or whatever because it's already there. There's nothing we can do now. Are we just dealing with what we got, or we have to do something more radical?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think from the Charlanta.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, the question was, that some of the things we've already set in motion have a lot of inertia to them. Should we just take that inertia as fact and as reality and respond in light of that inertia, or to what extent should we be actively challenging that inertia? Is that, yeah. And so I think in practice, we'll need to be doing both. But I think very often a key piece is figuring out what are the things that might change that inertia. And so in the I-85 example, if you make pretty subtle changes to the regulations of where you can and cannot build with regard to habitat type, it radically changes how that city grows. And so in that case, there are local and state level policies that actually have a huge impact on what that city will look like. And that's it. I mean, it's not an easy change, but that is a possible change. And so I think in the case of Charlanta, that the key is not to see this is what will happen. This is what will happen if we do nothing. And then to zoom in, are there places where we have these key things we can change? And what are the most important of those key things? And then I think there are places that look inertial, like universities, that we can actually bring people together and do far more creative things than we think. And come back to me in like 5 years on that one. But that would be my broad argument, is that very often what we're seeing is what's the status quo? And then a key piece is to zoom in on like, well, what do I know that can bear on how we might change that status quo in the biggest way? And I guess one of my findings as an ecologist is that sometimes what it takes to change the status quo is very different than what I'm working on. And so figuring out how do I, if my knowledge bears on changing the status quo, how do I make sure I'm involved in that piece, or my students are involved, those kinds of things. But no, with Charlanta as an example, like that's a terrible city. And so I think we need to be active in thinking about how we reimagine land use policy so that is not our future city. And we're looking right now, because that study's a little bit old now, to see, have the last 10 years actually looked like what we imagined, or something different, because there have been some policy changes in some places. And did those have a big difference on what resulted? And I think, speaking to the students a little bit, that my personal experience too is that different people have different places that they feel most powerful and engaging in those kinds of changes. And so one of the keys for me individually has been to figure out, well, what are the places that my abilities reconcile with what can be changed? And I think for each of you, figuring out like what are the places where your deep knowledge, your abilities can be connected to the changes that are possible. Diverting the question a little bit. Yeah.
I think that's a great place to stop. And so I want to thank Rob, but first I want to remind